fine. So welcome everyone to VFI Educates. I'm not going to pretend I know what number this is, like Steve knows, but I believe it's in the 300s at this point.
Oh, wow.
Um, I'm not sure if we have anyone new here, but if we do, please feel free to go to our website. This is run by Volunteers for Israel. We have vfi-usa.org. I'll put it in the chat if you're interested in coming to Israel, volunteering, and touring. And if you have any questions during the course of the program, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them when Eyal is done speaking. We're very lucky to have Eyal Dujovny back here with us to give another talk. And I'm just going to introduce him and then I'm going to mute everyone. So if you are talking like Eyal, you'll have to unmute yourself, Eyal, before you talk.
Okay.
And please stay muted throughout. And then afterward, I'll tell you when you can unmute. All right. So to give you an introduction, Dr. Eyal Dujovny has been an Israeli government licensed tour guide since 2016. He considers himself first and foremost an educator and cross-cultural broker. His academic and professional background in anthropology and international relations frame his guiding, and he adopts a holistic approach in his work, which provides both depth and nuance to his tours. In addition to guiding, he maintains a Substack called The Israeli Anthropologist, where he writes about the intersection of history, culture, and politics in Israel. And Eyal, I'm sure we'd love to get a link to your Substack in the chat when you get a chance, but please take the stage.
So today we're going to talk about the Israeli settlers and the settler movement. I changed the title a little bit as I was working on it. I thought this is a provocative question, but one that I think needs to be discussed, whether Israeli settlers are a sect apart. And so I put in some images here. We're going to talk about some of these images, some of the things that we're seeing in this first initial image. But we've got a lot to cover, and I will say just strap in and we'll take it from here. Let's start out with a definition. What is a settler? If you look online, you'll find a lot of possible definitions. The one that I put here, a settler is a person who establishes or joins a permanent presence that is separate to existing communities. The entity a settler establishes as a settlement comes to us from Wikipedia. And in that light, I don't know if you guys are familiar, if people are familiar with the game, The Settlers of Catan. It's a very popular game. It's a board game that's been around for 25 years. And it has this kind of notion of settling a new place, joining a permanent presence, creating a new establishing a new settlement. But often people will say, wait a minute, not so fast. Doesn't the word settler have a pejorative aspect to it as well? Right? Of course it does. For many people, when it refers to Israel, the idea of settler brings up many negative associations, such as settler colonialism, illegal settlements, occupied territories, and dislocation of the native Palestinians, as well as simply an obstacle to peace. So perhaps unsurprisingly, there are newer definitions of the word settler, such as this one here from the American Heritage Dictionary. This is from the 2011 edition, which says one who settles in a new region, especially a region that has few occupants or is occupied by people of a different ethnic or religious group. And it's precisely because of this negative association that's taken over the word settler in the past 30 years that the game Settlers of Catan, just a few years ago, removed the word settlers from it and rebranded in 2015 for its 20th anniversary. And it's just called Catan today because they didn't want to be associated with the word settler. So we have here the two aspects. It's just moving to a place, or is it something which is an obstacle to peace, something pejorative? And then we have a religious connotation in our context here in Israel of the word settler, right? What you saw on the title page were visibly religious Jews with forelocks and kippas and tzitzis, many of them with embroidered kippas, yarmulkes of the Bnei Akiva movement, but others in black and white of the more orthodox. In Israel, when you say the word settlers, it can conjure up images of the religious Zionist parties, or even of the more extreme, what's being called hilltop youth. Or when you say settler, it can conjure up the idea of violence. But I want to start out by saying that when we say settler in English, there are two ways we could say that in Hebrew. And the two words in Hebrew are, first of all, mityashev, which is a more kind of anodyne word from the word lashevet, to sit, where we get the word Shabbat. Like the word settle in English is also from the word seat. But the word that's more common in Hebrew when we talk about settlers is not that it's something that's just settled and sitting, but we use the word mitnachel from the word nachala, or inheritance. And the inheritance that this is alluding to is the tribal allocations mentioned, given by God to the Jewish people in the book of Joshua. And I chose a map here which shows the different tribes, right? The 12 tribes besides Levi is not here because they were in all the tribes. This is the tribal allocations. This is the one that was originally allocated to the Jews. And I chose this specific version of it because it actually doesn't include the Philistine areas as part of a separate entity, Philistia. This never actually existed, what you see here, but it was what was promised. The Philistine areas of Ekron, Ashdod, Jaffa, Ashkelon, Gaza, those were under Philistine control, but they belonged to Judah under the promise that God gave to the Jews in the book of Joshua, right? So Gaza actually belongs to the tribe of Judah, according to the Bible. So obviously this idea, this way of thinking about settlements, i.e. is taking up an inheritance, is something which is really deeply meaningful for religious Jews. It's so significant precisely because it's what's called deoraita, or a divine decree from God, rather than derabanan, or a rabbinic law. And here you can see where Gaza is if you haven't been watching the news lately. So based on this religious connection and the images I showed you up front, you would be right to assume that settlers are primarily religious and motivated by religious impulses. However, if that's what you think about settlers and the settler movement, you'd actually be mistaken, since about half of all settlers are not religious. And they live in cities near large metropolises like Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. You can think of cities like Eyal or Ma'ale Adumim, where there are many people who are just living there because it's cheaper. They don't necessarily even identify with the settler movement, and they can even be religious and not identify with the settler movement. If you think about a place like Modi'in Ilit, which is not far from the airport, you have residents that are all very religious, ultra-Orthodox, but not necessarily Zionist in their outlook. And so they just had an opportunity to live right on the border there within territory that was captured in 1967. It's much cheaper for them, and it's really economic reasons. They're religious, but they're not involved in the settler movement. And there are many settlements in places like the Jordan Valley and the Golan Heights, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that were founded by the Labor Party, and the settlers there vote for left-of-center parties. But in this particular talk, since the people who we regularly see on the news, the ones that make the most noise, are religious settlers, I'm going to focus on religious settlers. And these images that you're seeing here are different types of settlements. Like the bottom right is in the Golan Heights. It's Kibbutz Marom. On the bottom left, you have Ma'ale Adumim, and above it as well. And you have Shomron, and even in the Jordan Valley, small little settlements that are leftist settlements like Gilgal in the top right here. But we'll focus primarily on religious settlers. But before we do that, we also have to do some more defining. We have to ask ourselves and think about what is a settler, what is a settlement, and how many settlers are there? And as always, this depends on how you define settlements. According to the Israeli government, there are somewhere in the vicinity of 500,000 settlers in Judea and Samaria. What you see on the left side here, Judea and Samaria, or Yehuda v'Shomron in Hebrew. There's about 500,000. But from the perspective of the United Nations, this isn't true. This is an undercount, since it doesn't include the 220,000 people who live in East Jerusalem, nor the 31,000 that are spread across some 35 settlements in the Golan Heights, which you can see on the right, which Israel annexed formally, like it did Jerusalem. Both were annexed by Israel in different periods, and hence the people who live there from an Israeli legal perspective are not settlers in the sense that the United Nations is referring to it, because they're part of Israel now. So how many settlements are there in all? Again, it depends on how you count them. In Judea and Samaria, if we just take Judea and Samaria, there are about 140 government-sanctioned settlements. And in the Golan Heights, there are 35 settlements. 12 Jerusalem neighborhoods are considered by the UN settlements. And there are up to 200 wildcat outposts that we'll get back to later that are not authorized by the government, but condoned by it. So it really depends on what you're looking at when we talk about how many settlers and how many settlements are there. Next, we need to talk a little bit about labor Zionism, which was the ideology that was the one that helped form the state in the beginning. And as I mentioned in a previous lecture that I gave, the movement of Zionism was a darling of the left, at least until the 1960s. And there were many reasons for this, but primarily it was because many of the early pioneers who arrived in the land of Israel at the turn of the last century were of a socialist and an atheist bent. So they weren't religious. They were socialists and atheists. And they came from a perspective, they came primarily from Eastern Europe, and they brought a perspective which said they shouldn't have to wait for salvation anymore from God, but argued that redemption would be accomplished through the fruit of Jewish labor, of their labor. They would reach a period of redemption. And labor Zionism extolled the land and saw becoming a farmer and making the wasteland bloom the highest good possible. And by doing this, Jews would leap over 2,000 years of Jewish history, which was history of suffering and second-class citizenship. And here, by working the land, they could achieve redemption. And this was particularly true in the kibbutz movement, which was a utopian socialist movement that played a decisive political role in the pre-state period and until, I would argue, the 1970s. The kibbutz movements and this socialist ideology. It was socialist political parties that led Israel continuously from the 1920s until the late 1970s, when the Likud party finally managed to form a governing coalition. It's important to note that part of Zionism's bona fides with the left was that it was understood as a national liberation movement and part of an anti-colonial struggle, which is very different from how the left sees us today. And indeed, Zionism first confronted the Ottomans as a national liberation movement, and then had an active anti-colonial struggle with the British Empire, which ruled the Mandate of Palestine between 1918 and 1948, when Israel gained independence. Starting with the Balfour Declaration in 1917, the British received the mandate from the League of Nations, as I'm sure you know, in 1922, which committed the British to establishing a Jewish state. Since the British began to cool on this idea almost immediately after they arrived in the land of Israel and they began to renege on their promises. The Jewish community, which held out hope for the British, they began to process of pushing for what you would call facts on the ground. Or as Moshe Smilansky famously said, the borders of Zion are marked by the furrow of the plow. In other words, wherever we establish settlements, there will be the future borders of the state. It's crucial to point out here, before I continue, especially since this is going to be online afterwards, that until 1948, all of the settlements that Jews established in the land of Israel were legally purchased. They were on land that had been legally purchased with the papers. They were very careful about this because they didn't want the British to remove them from any place. They were all legally purchased. Nonetheless, after 1936, when the Arab revolt begins, they often established settlements without the express permission of the British. So on land that was owned, but without first getting permission from the British authorities, and often in direct opposition to the British, who sometimes would tear down these settlements. And here what you see on the left and right are images of what's called in Hebrew Choma u'Migdal, or in English, tower and stockade, whereby Jewish settlers would establish a settlement literally in a matter of hours. Near David, Tel Amal in the Jezreel Valley is typically considered the first of a total of 57 settlements, including Hanita near the Lebanon border, Biria near Tzfat, Ein Gev, Ginosar on the Sea of Galilee. All of these are some of the most well-known tower and stockade settlements that were built during this period after the beginning of the Arab Revolt, when the British really cooled to the idea of a Jewish state and limited Jewish immigration. So while this expansion was slowed down during World War II, it began again after the war, and it famously included the 11 points in the Negev, which involved the establishment of 11 settlements on Yom Kippur itself. And the British, never expected that would happen. 11 settlements appeared overnight, and they were constructed and established on Yom Kippur. And the British, up to that point, had attempted to prevent Jewish settlement in the Negev, and were caught completely flat-footed because they didn't expect this to happen. The reason I tell you all of this is, first of all, there's a long tradition of settling the land, often without permission of the authorities. But there are two important takeaways. One is, or three important takeaways. One is the secular Zionist kibbutzim were the vanguard of a settlement movement prior to the settlements that we think of today as settlements. And in Zionism, there's a deep sense that Jews must refuse being victims and be actors in this world. Or as my father of blessed memory used to say to me, what matters is not what the Gentiles say, but what the Jews do. And this is important because due to this kind of situation where the British were preventing Jewish settlement, and a sense of British perfidy, that the British betrayed the Balfour Declaration and their promise to the Jewish people, what came out of this whole situation and continues to this day, in my opinion, in Israeli culture, is what's been called a culture of illegalism and a lack of respect for authority, which developed in the Yishuv, in the pre-state Yishuv, that would later come back to haunt it. All right. Notwithstanding the fact that labor Zionism has played the most prominent political role and was central to Zionism's success, it never acted in a vacuum. It was never the only game in town. There were other movements, ideological movements going on around it. And we all know the old chestnut, right? We joke that we say that when there are two Jews, there are three opinions. Well, perhaps the most famous opposition to labor Zionism was the revisionist movement expounded by Jabotinsky, Begin, and which is represented today by the Likud party, which is led by Benjamin Netanyahu. But today I want to focus on another challenge, another way of doing Zionism, which is called or another branch of Israeli politics, which is known as religious Zionism. So I don't know how many of you recognize the individual in this image, in this photo. Many people, I'd be surprised if many people know who this rabbi is. But I would argue that he is one of the most influential, if not the most influential rabbi of the 20th century. And the person I'm referring to here in this image is Rabbi Abraham Isaac HaKohen Kook, who lived from 1865 to 1935 and was known by his disciples as Harav Kook. Harav Kook was originally from what is now Latvia and immigrated to Israel in 1905 to be the chief rabbi of Jaffa. He was trained in some of the best yeshivas of his time, and he was an unbending, this is important to note, he was an unbending Orthodox Jew in his worldview and his outlook. And even though he was that way, he was appointed the first head Ashkenazi rabbi during British rule, and he saw his role as one that represented all Jews, regardless of their level of religiosity. Okay? Regardless of their level of religiosity. Already in 1913, in fact, he organized a delegation of rabbis to the various Jewish settlements of the first and second Aliyah to better understand their worldview, as well as to do outreach, or what's called in Hebrew kiruv work. Unlike the majority of Orthodox rabbis who completely disdained Zionism because its adherents were not observant or even atheist, Harav Kook saw them as the harbingers of salvation and supported the Zionist cause. In fact, he characterized the non-religious Zionists as, quote-unquote, good sinners or, quote-unquote, principled evildoers. From his perspective, Zionism was a stage in God's plan, and he needed these people, these good sinners, to do it. And eventually everybody would be religious, and we would inherit the whole land. But this is just one stage, and we should support the stage even if these people are not religious like us. And one way that he supported Zionism was by updating religious law, or halacha, to reflect the fact that Jews were once again living in the Holy Land and had to practice traditions that were set aside for thousands of years, such as Shemitah, which is leaving the land fallow, or even simply governance, like how do Jews govern halachically, were questions that he was asking. He updated halacha to deal with the questions that were arising from everyday life of living in the Holy Land, in Zion, in Zion. So while many saw Zionism and religion in opposition to one another, Harav Kook actually married the two ideologies together. And it should be said that while today this seems perfectly normal, and even religious Zionism is a muscular form of Judaism, this outcome couldn't have been predicted from the outset. Rather, religious Zionism spent the first 50 years of its existence as not religious enough for the Orthodox and too religious for the socialist Zionists who were in power. So what happened to change this picture? Put differently, why didn't religious Zionism end up like conservative Judaism or modern Orthodoxy that are being torn apart by their internal oppositions as we speak? How did we get to the point where today's religious Zionists are a rapidly growing community with political muscle and ensconced in the highest positions in Israel's halls of power? Well, the short answer to that question is the 6-Day War. During the war, Israel, which faced off against Egypt, Syria, Jordan, more than quadrupled the size of the country. Except for parts of southern Lebanon that belonged to the biblical tribes of Asher and Naphtali in the book of Joshua again, or the Transjordan tribes of Menashe, Gad, and Reuven, for the first time since the formulation of the Zionist idea, the vast majority of the land of Israel that was promised in the Bible by God was in the hands of the children of Israel. So this was something that hadn't existed in over 2,000 years. And for many Jews, and even non-Jews, Israel's victory in the 67 war, against all odds, was viewed immediately in eschatological terms, i.e., as a harbinger of the final days or the messianic age. For religious Zionists, this even took on a particular resonance in the light of a talk that was given at the Merkaz Harav Yeshiva by the school's headmaster and son of Harav Kook. Merkaz Harav was set up by Rabbi Kook, and his son led it for many years. His son's name was Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook. 1 month before the war broke out, which was on Israel's Independence Day, he gave a talk, and he suddenly broke down crying and called out a lament when he recalled his thoughts on the partition plan of 1947. And what did he say? He quoted from the book of Joel. He said, "They have divided my land. Where is Hebron? Have we forgotten it? And where is Ar Shechem, which is Nablus? Have we forgotten it? And our Jericho, and the other side of the Jordan? It is ours, every clod of soil, every bit of earth. I was torn to pieces in 1947. I could not celebrate." When later, barely a month later, Hebron, Shechem, Jericho were all in Israel's hands, his lament, his speech, was interpreted by his students as nothing less than pure prophecy. Okay. In this lecture, as I already noted, we're going to focus more on the religious settlers, but I want to take a little step back first, now that we've kind of set the stage of where this is coming from. And we're going to talk about the religious settlers and how they end up in the news a lot in recent years, and certainly since October 7th. But I want to also give some perspective. And I want to make sure that, we understand that this was a phenomenon. What happened after the unbelievable victory of the Six-Day War was a phenomenon which, I think sociologists would call it effervescence. People were just so overwhelmed with the emotion of it all. And it wasn't just by people who had a religious bent. I want to introduce you to the movement for the whole land of Israel. Hatnuah Leman Eretz Yisrael Hashlema, which was founded July 1968, only a month after the end of the war. And the movement was led by the famous Israeli poet Natan Alterman, and it galvanized people from all sides of the political divide and for this cause. And I'll read some of the ideas. In their first newspaper ad, which you can see here on the left, they declare that, I quote, "In the same way that we have no right to forsake the state of Israel, we are commanded to receive what we received by the hand of God, the land of Israel." So we have a commandment from God to keep this land. Alterman argued that anyone who returns these pieces of land will have to write a different Bible. And who are the people signed on this? Among others, Yitzhak Tabenkin, who was the ideologue and head of the United Kibbutz movement, the journalist, poet, and novelist Chaim Guri, the poet and writer Aaron Amir, Rachel Yanaid Ben Tzvi, who was an educator, a writer, the wife of Israel's second president, Yitzhak Ben Tzvi, Zev Vilnai, a very well-known geographer, author, and lecturer, the poet Uri Tzvi Greenberg, Israel Eldad of the Lehi movement. So you have Lehi, you have Mapai, Mapam, left, right, all together, and even Shai Agnon, who was the Nobel Prize laureate by this point, signed on to this letter, demanding that the country keep the land of Israel. In short, what we're talking about here is the who's who of Israeli society. And this organization even tried to win Knesset seats, though they were unsuccessful. And indeed, there was the question of what to do with these territories. On the one hand, there was no great desire to rule over 1 million Arabs. On the other hand, giving up the territories was difficult for the reasons mentioned above, and also because Israelis then and now suffer from what we could call a trust deficit vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Why is that? Well, the short answer to that trust deficit is just look at Jewish history. The more proximate answer has to do with the history of the British Mandate, which I already mentioned. And we already spoke about the illegalism surrounding the establishment of outposts. But there was also the white paper that came out during the Arab Revolt in the 1930s, which limited immigration at precisely the moment European Jewry could have been saved. And then there's the profound Jewish sense of abandonment that the Jewish people have due to the Holocaust and the fact that no one came to our rescue. Similarly, there was a profound sense of abandonment prior to the Six-Day War, during which the Arab world openly and gleefully promised to conduct a second Holocaust. The world didn't do anything. Last but certainly not least, there were important factors tied to what has been called Israel's forgotten war, which is the 1956 Sinai campaign. At the end of that war, and by diktat from the United States, Eisenhower, Israel vacated the territories it had captured, and the UN peacekeepers were placed in the Sinai Peninsula to act as a wedge between Israel and Egypt. Nonetheless, in 1967, when Nasser ordered the UN troops out, they just left without putting up a fight. So even though Israel's own Foreign Ministry Council, Ted Maron, wrote a legal opinion in 1967, right after the war, stating that settlements in occupied territories would be considered a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, the Israeli leadership was predisposed against what they saw as the farce of international institutions that only punch when they're punching down, or as Ben-Gurion famously said, shmum, who cares about the UN? Together with these questions surrounding strategic depth and defensible borders, this violation of trust that Jews felt greatly colored Israeli decision-making in the post-1967 war era. Having said all of that, and explaining where Israel and Jews are coming from, to be honest, on multiple levels, but on many levels, it's just simply a moot point, because as we know, the Arab League met in Khartoum in August of 1967 and declared what has become known as the three no's. What are the three no's? No peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel, no recognition of Israel. And though while there are Arab apologists today who employ a lot of sophistry to argue that Israel did not understand the true and more subtle meanings of the three no's, it meant that negotiation over land for peace, which was in Resolution 242, was off the table, and settlement of the land became a legitimate option. Remember, by August, there is no settlement really, and so it becomes a legitimate option. And this brings us to something which is going to stick with us to this very day, which is what became known as the Alon Plan. But first I want to tell you a little bit about Yigal Alon. I feel like he's largely been forgotten today, but it's hard to underestimate his contributions to the state of Israel. Born in Kfar Tavor in 1918, he was a member of the Haganah, the Palmach. He rose to the rank of commander at the age of 27 of the Palmach. He commanded the troops during the Altalena affair. He oversaw Rabin in the Altalena affair. He was a general in the War of Independence who oversaw the capture of the Galilee and the Negev all the way down to Eilat. He studied for a degree in philosophy at Oxford. He served in the Knesset from 1954 until his death in 1980. He helped the Labor He helped found the Labor Party as well as Kibbutz Ginosar. He was Minister of Labor, Immigration, Education, and Foreign Minister. And he was the first Israeli Prime Minister who was born in Israel in that brief period between Levi Eshkol and Golda Meir. Usually we think of Rabin, but it was actually Yigal Alon who was the first Israeli-born Prime Minister. But what we're really particularly interested in is what's known as the Alon Plan. And it's important to note that prior to the Six-Day War, Alon, by his own admission, was an advocate for Jewish control of all of the land of Israel that had existed under the British mandate. Yet, following the initial euphoria of victory, he faced the fact that there were over 1 million Arabs living in the newly occupied territories that Israel would do well not to govern. And what you see on the map here is a proposal that came out of this realization, uh, which he felt took Israel's security concerns into account, as well as most of Israel's religious and historical claims. What you see here in green are Arab areas of the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, and the blue are the Jewish areas. Okay? By this I mean that the Jordan Valley, which is the border with Jordan, would remain in Israeli hands, right? To prevent smuggling of weapons and to control the border. And one sec. And to control the border. Sorry, one second. Okay. They remain in Israeli hands to prevent smuggling of weapons. To accomplish this, he proposed building civilian outposts and military bases along the Jordan Valley. The entirety of Jerusalem would remain in Israeli hands and be settled on all sides. And the historical injustice of Gush Etzion would be addressed, which I'll talk about in a minute. And Jewish rights and the historical injustice of Hebron would also be addressed. Palestinians living in these green territories would remain Jordanian citizens and could travel to Jordan by way of... Oh, hold on one sec. Oh, sorry, I thought I had a message from Ilana. Sorry. Jordanian could travel to Jordan by way of Jericho. At the same time, and no less important, Israel would annex the Gaza Strip. So Gaza Strip is on the side here. Israel, he suggested already back then that Israel should annex the entire Gaza Strip, and it's 350,000. That's how many people were living in Gaza in 1967 versus the over 2 million today. It's 350,000 inhabitants would be resettled elsewhere. So you thought you heard it first from Trump. It actually was proposed by Alon in 1967. Though this plan was never formally adopted by the government, I think it's worth looking at its various parts a bit closer. First of all, I should say that the first settlement on all of the territories that Israel captured in 1967 was technically actually in the Golan, in Merom Golan, in the Golan Heights. And I'm going to forego discussing the Golan Heights as well as the Gaza Strip in this talk. But if those two areas interest you, we can answer questions in the session, the question and answer session afterwards. Gush Etzion is located south of Jerusalem. It's a rocky area, a mountainous area, that was purchased by a man named Holtzman in 1935 to serve as a resort for those wishing to escape the heat. And when the Arab revolt broke out in 1936, the place was abandoned and went out of business. And so it was purchased by the KKL, the Keren Kayemet L'Israel, which held on to the land until 1943, when it settled that area with religious Zionists who had recently arrived from Poland, and they called it Kfar Etzion after Holtzman, which means tree man. Etz is tree in Hebrew. 3 other kibbutzes, including a labor kibbutz, popped up around it: Ein Tzurim, Revadim, and Mesuot Yitzchak by 1948. Yet during the War of Independence, the Etzion bloc communities found themselves surrounded by Arabs, and attempts to resupply them, several attempts, ended in tragedy and loss of many lives. In January of 1948, the women and children of Gush Etzion were evacuated, and only the men remained to fight. And they fought until May 13th, when it was captured, and all 129 defenders of Gush Etzion were killed. 15 of them, after they were captured, were murdered in cold blood. Remember, we're talking May 13th, 1948. This is the eve of the Declaration of Independence. And due to this terrible tragedy that happened just the day before the Declaration of Independence, it was designated Memorial Day in Israel. In 1967, as the war, or the Six-Day War, is still raging, Hanan Porat, whose family was from Gush Etzion, goes back to the land where his parents had settled, and he begins to lobby for it to be resettled by the children who were orphaned, the children of the defenders who were killed by the Jordanians. And so at first, the government says, no, 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 we can't do this. We may need to return this for peace. But following the three no's of Khartoum in September of 1967, the Eshkol government grants permission to reestablish these these Gush Etzion communities. This is seen by everyone on the Israeli side as righting a historical wrong. And this is something which is repeated in other places, including Neve Yaakov, a neighborhood of Jerusalem, Kfar Darom in the Gaza Strip, and Beit Arava by the Dead Sea. Let me give you another example of settlement. Hebron, or in Arabic, Al-Halil, the beloved. Known as Al-Halil in Arabic, Hebron is mentioned in the Bible for the Machpelah cave purchased by Abraham as the family burial plot. According to the Bible and Jewish tradition, the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are buried here, the building in the bottom middle, as well as Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah. Rachel is buried near Bethlehem. There's even a tradition that's accepted by Jews, Christians, and Muslims that Adam and Eve are actually buried here. Moreover, Abraham lived here in Hebron for most of the time that he was in the land of Israel. And King David's first capital, the first 7 years that King David was a king, the capital was in Hebron. In short, Hebron is a very holy city for Jews and one of the 4 holy cities. Nonetheless, since the Byzantine era, Jewish access was severely limited until it was completely prohibited during the Ottoman period. Jews could only ascend to the 7th step of what they called the Ibrahimi Mosque, as it's called in Arabic. So Jews couldn't enter and go and visit the graves of our patriarchs and matriarchs. It was a situation that lasted for 400 years, through even the British Mandate and, of course, during Jordanian rule. In fact, in 1967, during the war, when Rabbi Goren arrived in the city during the capture of the city, he was the first Jew, probably in maybe even 500 years, to enter the site and to pray therein. But having said that, it's important to note that even with all of these prohibitions, being close to the cave was also something that was seen as very holy. Just like today, being close to the Temple Mount in the Western Wall is something which Jews consider to be a very holy act. And so a vibrant Jewish community developed in Hebron, and it lived there for hundreds of years until it was completely destroyed by the massacres of 1929, when 67 Jews were hacked to death by their neighbors. And while there were attempts to revive the community after 1929, after everyone fled, during the Arab Revolt, everybody left, and the British basically evacuated the Jewish community. And since 1936 to 1967, there were no Jews. It was ethnically cleansed of Jews. So from the original perspective, actually, of the Elon Plan, Hebron, with its overwhelmingly Muslim population, was not actually slated to be part of Israel, and the government resisted any calls to allow Jews to return. And that's why it was only in 1968 when some religious Jews, led by Rabbi Moshe Levinger, who you can see on the right here, established facts on the ground in Hebron. What they did was they went to a local hotel, and they said to the hotel owner, we want to rent out the hotel for Pesach, for Passover. And then when Passover ended, they said, we're not going anywhere. And so a solution was found where they were moved to military headquarters in Hebron, and the government quickly built a neighborhood known as Kiryat Arba, which was completed in 3 years in 1971, and that's how the Jewish settlement was reestablished. So we have an example here in which Jews returned to places from which they'd been expelled, such as in Gush Etzion, and these were places of religious and biblical importance. So what happens in Hebron is actually repeated later on in other settlements, such as Alon Moreh near Nablus, which is biblical Shechem, Shiloh, the place of the tabernacle, Beit El, where Jacob wrestles with the angel. These are all biblical sites. And so what complicates the clarity and simplicity of the Elon Plan was that it didn't really fully take in the allure of the Bible lands. Moreover, there was this inconvenient fact that Whereas in the Bible, the Philistines were on the coast and the Jews were in the mountains. Now the order of things had flipped, where Jews were on the coast and the Palestinians, who sometimes consider themselves, going back to the Philistines, were on the mountaintops. So this was a problem, especially if you consider that the land of Israel is a warehouse of biblical and Jewish history, and any attempt to ignore this fact was kind of doomed from the start. One of the key aspects of the Alon Plan was to reestablish a line of defense along the Jordan River that would become Israel's border with Jordan and would put an end to infiltration and gun running. And where do these settlers who settle the Jordan Valley come from? The labor Zionist movement. These are kibbutzes and moshavot that are difficult, living in difficult areas, a difficult climate. It's very hot. Farming's not easy. They needed ideologically committed people, and they found more than their fair share of secular labor Zionists or atheists who settled these communities of Gilgal, Naomi, Naran, Ptzael, all of them. And religious communities as well, like Mecholam, Ma'alot Ephraim, and Mesuah. Those are religious communities in the Jordan Valley that developed. So in practice, this was actually the most effective part of the Alon Plan, because if you go today, all that area is 2 rows of Jewish communities and army bases. And though the communities never really took off, they're all very small communities. We're talking about hundreds of people, maybe, something like, 10,000 people living in that area, each one with a couple hundred people. It still was meant to and does serve as a deterrent to invasion and to smuggling. On the other hand, it's also a target for the type of things that happened on October 7th, where people went through the border and went into these small communities. So we have a similar kind of situation, just like in October 7th, where around Gaza you have all these labor Zionist communities. Here in the Jordan Valley, you have a similar situation. All right, well, since we're speaking about October 7th, there's a twist in the plot. And that twist in the plot is the Yom Kippur War and its aftermath. Just like October 7th, Yom Kippur caught Israel by surprise and shook the country to its very core. And, the October 7th happens literally 50 years later. For religious Zionists who saw the Six-Day War as what's known in Aramaic, Atchalta de Geula, the beginning of redemption or salvation, the Yom Kippur War, especially as it happened on Yom Kippur itself, was, from their perspective, a theological challenge to their worldview, and began to ask themselves, had God abandoned the Jews, or is this an invitation to even greater devotion? And if anybody has ever studied sociology, and maybe you're familiar with the work of Leon Festinger, he wrote a seminal work called When Prophecy Fails. He followed a doomsday cult in Chicago. And what he found was when the prophecy fails, what happened was some members leave the cult, but most of the members double down on their beliefs rather than ever abandon them. And similarly, religious Zionists took the setback of the Yom Kippur War to mean that they needed to up the pace of the redemption of the land of Israel. Why? Because the Gentiles had attacked precisely because redemption was so very near. And so we have to up the pace, we have to work harder. And in 1974, an organization known as Gush Emunim, the Block of the Faithful, is established, ostensibly headed by Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who gave the famous speech. It included the likes of Moshe Levinger of Hebron, Hanan Porad of Gush Etzion, and it worked as a lobby to pressure the government to speed up settlement in every part of Judea and Samaria. They saw the state of Israel, the state, not the land, the state of Israel as a flawed but divine instrument that could be used to redeem the land of Israel, which was a holy land. And with the election of the Likud government starting in 1977, they now had strong government support for their settlement plans. And their first and most iconic victory was at a place called Sebastia, even before this election in 1975, so 1 year after their founding. Sebastia was originally known in Hebrew as Shomron. It was the capital of the Israel, in biblical Israel, was Shomron. meaning as opposed to Jerusalem, which was the capital of Judea. It was named Sebastia after Caesar Augustus by Herod. Sebastos means venerable in Greek. And Herod was its client king of Augustus, and so he created a huge city there in his honor. It became known as Sebastia. This location was chosen by Gush Emunim because of its symbolic value, the symbolic nature. And a group of 20 or so activists, including Levinger and Porat, occupied several abandoned buildings, including the building you see in the back part of this photo here, which was a train station from Ottoman period train station. And they arrived here in 1975, and this settlement isn't officially endorsed by the government, so they're removed by the IDF, and this happens several times. The Israeli Defense Forces remove them, they come back, they sit there again, they have no permission to be there, but they keep doing it again. And like the labor Zionists who I told you about in the mandatory period, what the whole goal of this exercise was to force the government's hand and to set up to show that the people want this and we're going to make it happen, even if you tell us that it's not allowed or illegal. And this was really a watershed moment which galvanized the entire religious Zionist movement, and is followed up with a march of some 20,000 people who reoccupy Sebastia once they're removed a couple times. And the government eventually does relent and agrees to Jewish settlement nearby in a place known today as Elon Moreh. This is a huge victory for religious Zionists. It shows that they have political muscle, and it has multiplier effects during Begin's tenure as prime minister. And this is important also for another reason, because we have here now a new settlement which was settled and established in the heart of an Arab majority area in opposition to the Allon plan and to government policies. So mostly what Sebastia showed was their ability to use the media to their advantage and newfound political clout. Now, at this point, of course, it would make most sense for me to talk about the first and second intifadas, the Oslo Accords, areas A, B, C, and if you want, I can answer questions on that. Instead, I think it's better to jump ahead here, and for the purpose of this talk, to skip to the 2005 disengagement from Gaza, which we just commemorated, happened 20 years ago. Last month was 20 years. I bring this up because I think it's really difficult, it's impossible really to underestimate the deep psychological scars that this left to this day, nor the extent to which it impacts Israeli politics to this day. What was the disengagement? In 2005, during the premiership of Ariel Sharon, and in the wake of the Second Intifada, 21 communities totaling 8,000 people were dismantled and forced to leave the Gaza Strip. This was meant to be a trial run for a larger disengagement from the West Bank, and even included 4 small settlements in Samaria. It was perceived wrongly by the Palestinians as a triumph of their resistance approach, and it's true that there were more troops and settlers in Gaza, but it didn't mean that those settlements couldn't have continued in Gaza. So while the majority of Israelis supported the disengagement plan at the time, including, by the way, Benjamin Netanyahu, it is widely perceived as an abject failure today, which pitted Jew against Jew, tore at the fabric of Israeli society amid what you can see here, abject scenes of Jews being forcibly removed from their homes and even from synagogues. This was imagery which was redolent of many past Jewish traumas. And for those who lived in Gaza, it was most of all a betrayal of their ideals by the state which they felt they were serving, a state that was headed by a right-wing government which they had voted for, and they felt threw them under the bus. And in fact, to this day, 96% of those surveyed who were there, who lived in Gaza, say that they were betrayed. Among 18 to 24-year-old religious Zionists, to this day in general, 57% surveyed said they would refuse an order to remove settlements in the future. And this was also a personal tragedy, which resulted in divorces, substance abuse issues, displacement. In fact, over half of those who were removed from Gaza have reported that they suffer from depression. And a full 10 years after the disengagement, half of those evacuated didn't even have permanent housing. They were living in caravans. So while well-meaning friends of Israel abroad and in diaspora applauded this decision. There's a strong argument to be made that much of Israeli politics since the disengagement is in reaction to these events. For example, the push for legislative reforms, which we had before October 7th, and is going on even now in the background, is strongest among those who believe that the Israeli Supreme Court ruled against them in the disengagement. They went to the Supreme Court in their decision, even though it has done, numerous times. The Supreme Court has sided with the religious Zionists as well. Simcha Rotman, who led the legislative reform movement push, called the 10-1 decision the day that the robe tore. All of this is to say, what I'm trying to say is that what happened in Gaza in 2005 radicalized the settler movement. So you have 67, you have Yom Kippur, and then you have this radicalization, which is it steps thing, it pushes things forward even more. And it brings us to what's been in the news lately, which are people who have been termed the hilltop youth. I make the argument, I believe, that they're a reaction to the disengagement from Gaza in 2005. Because what we saw in 2005 was a real rupture within the between the religious Zionism community and the state of Israel. The religious Zionists, or at least a section, and it's a small section, but a very vocal one, saw suddenly that the state were not just principled evildoers, as Rav Kook called them, but an obstacle to redemption that is in opposition to God's manifest plan. Their principal rabbinic justifications came from the work of Rabbi Meir Kahane, interestingly, and one of their main leaders to this day is Meir Ettinger, who is Rabbi Kahane's grandson. They're called the Hilltop Youth because they see themselves as pioneers who are redeeming the land one hilltop at a time. As you can see from the images of a boy here with a goat on his shoulders, they see themselves as the original Jews, the OG Jews, the original Jews who live as one with the land. And when the army begins to dismantle their wildcat settlements, they pop up, these settlements pop up on hilltops, and the army will come and remove them. What they do is what they call price tag attacks against the Palestinian population, as a way to bog down the army with having to deal with Palestinians who are rightly upset at what's being done in their communities. The worst example, I won't call it the best example, the worst example of this was in 2015 with the Duma arson attack, in which 2 adults and an 18-month-old child were burned to death. These are the people who have been sanctioned by the Biden administration. And even though they represent a fringe of a fringe, we're talking, people say maybe 500 people out of who are really like hardcore Hilltop Youth, out of a 500,000, meaning 0.001% or 1/100%. Unlike in the Palestinian Authority, the state doesn't sanction their activities or finance them or laud them in any way. In fact, the person you see in the image here with the on top and middle wearing prison clothes is Amiram Ben Uliel, who's convicted for 3 murders and has been sentenced to life imprisonment in Israel. So while little has been done against them, the government recognizes them as a threat to the state's monopoly on the use of force. There's another aspect which is important to point out also, which is that the way that they think about life is consistent with tribal communities, tribal nature. They see themselves as part of a tribe, and Palestinians part of a separate tribe. And hence, if you harm anyone in my tribe, I don't have to harm the person who harmed the person in my tribe. I just have to harm someone in your tribe. And because they don't, respect the state and reject its defense forces, they feel comfortable using violence. And that's really what's happening here with this community of people. So what does this all tell us about violence by settlers against the Palestinian population? I want to start by saying that I think it's a real problem that legitimately concerns the Palestinian population. In fact, according to surveys, 80% of Palestinians say that this is something that they worry about on a regular basis. Similarly, the international community and the media are expressing growing concern over this topic. In fact, so much so that the Biden administration, in its final days, announced, sanctions on Jewish settlers in Judea and Samaria. If one considers the numbers expressed here, such as you can see here in this picture, 1,800 settler attacks on Palestinians, it seems reasonable to sanction the perpetrators of these acts. The problem is that the devil, as always, is in the details. As the Israeli journalist Amit Segel pointed out, according to UN data, there have been 5,656 cases of settler violence in the territory since between 2016 and 2022, either meaning before October 7th. The problem was that 1,600 of these acts of violence occurred in Jerusalem and not in the territories, and it included every visit of groups of religious Jews to the Temple Mount. That's considered an act of violence. Or incidences of property damage. You even have a case where a Palestinian who attacked Jews was listed in the report twice as suffering violence. Once, after he attacked Jews, he was shot, so that was one act of violence. And the next day, when he died, that was listed as a killing, which was another act of violence. So you really need to look at the details. If there are car accidents, violence. If you take away all of these kinds of things, you really end up with about 20 to 30 incidents a month. And many of these are uninvestigated. And some of them are horrible outrages like Duma and Hawara, where you have this kind of Wild West vigilantism. There's certainly judicial leniency, but there are also those who want to create a false dichotomy by saying the Jewish terrorism, quote unquote, is as big of a problem as the Palestinian kind. And as we know, they often twist words around to meet their, political goals. By comparison, how many Palestinian attacks are there in an average month? According to the IDF, around 700. All right, we're reaching the end here, and I want to give you just a couple more examples of issues that are in the news lately and what they're about. Another issue which has been in the news a lot lately has been the E1 zone or E1 corridor. You're looking at this, kind of colored area, which is about 12 square kilometers near Ma'ale Adumim, which is a settlement. It's in the eastern part of Jerusalem, and it's not within the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem. And what's happened recently is 3,412 housing units for between 12 to 15,000 people has been approved, and European Union, United States, and Arab world have all complained about this. So the question is, why is all of this hullabaloo? Well, we can ask Bezalel Smotrich, who's always, as you know, soft-spoken, our finance minister, who said, while holding this map, that the approval of the housing units was a historic moment which practically erases the two-state delusion and consolidates the Jewish people's hold on the heart of the land of Israel. And here is something that the left and the Palestinians are in agreement with him. So Bezalel Smotrich has managed to unite everybody around this issue. And in fact, the U.S. has for 35 years prevented this from happening, the United States in particular. The reason is that you have these two large areas with Palestinian communities. One is in the north, Ramallah, the one in the south is Bethlehem. And this E1 neighborhood basically splits the West Bank in two. It bifurcates it. Notice also the blank areas here and here, north and south of Ma'ale Adumim. That's where there are cliffs. So you can't really build roads there. So they can't build a road which would go around. And even if they found an engineering solution, it would take a lot of time. You have to go down 400 meters, up 400 meters. And hence, there's no easy workaround. So what people are worried about is that this would effectively complete the encirclement of Jerusalem. It's a problem for Ramallah, which is supposed to be the Palestinian capital. But the question is this really, I think we need to ask ourselves, this is a problem. It would definitely help the Jewish communities. It would definitely help Israel hold on to Jerusalem. But this issue of contiguity is one that I want to raise and ask, is it really an issue? Why is it such an issue when there's no contiguity with Gaza, and a Palestinian state is supposed to have Gaza as well. And perhaps there could be tunnels or special roads. In fact, they're building a road right now called the Fabric of Life Road, and there's another road, Alternative Road 80, which goes in areas near Ma'ale Adumim, which could be the solution to this problem. So I'm not sure that this is as big of an issue as everybody makes it out to be, but certainly it's been in the news lately. All right. Lastly, we come back to the Alon plan, the original Alon plan, and we find out that what we're looking at today with E1 is that it basically does what Alon had planned. It keeps Jerusalem, divides the West Bank in two, and so on some level we're still carrying out, it continues to inform the Israeli settlement activities from the 1960s to today. The last issue that I want to bring up and discuss is Messianism. As you can see, once again, our friend Smotrich says we're in the process of redemption. Messianism is a revolutionary concept that at some point in the future, a savior figure will bring about a period of justice, salvation, and peace. According to religious scholars, Judaism is the first messianic religion in the history of the world, in that it proposes a historical end time that is mediated by an individual from David's line, the Davidic line. You could think of history as like a well-constructed story which has a happy ending. Christians also have messianic tendencies, right? For Christians, that end-time figure is Jesus, while for Jews, the Messiah has yet to reveal themselves. Jewish messianism, as espoused by religious Zionists, proposes the idea that settlement of the land of Israel, is the prerequisite for the end times and for the Messiah to appear. And since this was made possible by the victory of the Six-Day War, even a secular poet such as Alterman, as I mentioned before, got swept up and declared the war the zenith of Jewish history. This was contrary to previous generations of Jews who believed in waiting patiently for salvation. In fact, Zionism in general and religious Zionism in particular take an activist approach that ultimately stems from Lurianic Kabbalah. In Kabbalah, there is a long-standing debate about whether redemption comes from above versus the idea that it's possible to arouse divine responses by working from below. This is kind of like in the movie Field of Dreams, the idea that if you build it, he will come, in this case. That said, it's also important to note that following the debacle of the 17th century false messiah Shabtai Tzvi, there's a strong countercurrent within Judaism to Messianism. And among many critics of Jewish Messianism, none was as thoughtful and clear-eyed as the man you see here on the left, Professor Yeshayahu Leibovitz. Already in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, 1 year after the Six-Day War, even less than 1 year, he warned against occupation of a foreign population. Bucking the euphoria of his time, he wrote in 1968 that holding on to the newly conquered territories would have disastrous moral, political, and religious consequences. Moreover, with respect to religious Zionism, he rejected the ideas of Rabbi Kook as not only not being good ideas, he said Rabbi Kook's ideas were inimical to Jewish religious practice. He accused religious nationalists, especially Gush Emunim, of turning the land of Israel into an idol, elevating the land above God. For him, Judaism meant serving God through mitzvot, without expectation of reward, not worshipping territory. He believed that the expectation of a messianic age was a perversion of Judaism and feared that it would turn Judaism into a nationalistic cult. He insisted that the state of Israel must be seen as a political tool, and only a political tool, for Jewish survival, not as some divine redemptive event. The job of Jews basically is to do mitzvahs without expectation of reward. All right, some final thoughts here. Though unstated, Harav Kook subscribed to Enlightenment ideas of nationalism. He clearly was influenced by it. I don't know if you read Herder's work, late 18th, early 19th century, the ideas of nationalism which derived from Herder's concept of folk or the people, which was a community bound together by culture, language, history, traditions, and a special spirit, which he called Volksgeist. Each community had, according to Herder, a unique role to play in history, and each community had its own soul. His ideas can be a bit of a double-edged sword, right? Though Herder was against the idea of hierarchies between communities and helped create the cultural revivement movements of the 19th century, his ideas also trace themselves back to the philosophy that the Nazis used with their cultural chauvinism. So it's really a double-edged sword, right? He says each community has its soul and has a role to play. And for the Jews, apparently that role is to bring the Messiah if you're a religious Zionist. As Gershom Gorenberg also noted about religious Zionism, or Rav Kook, is that he didn't make peace with Zionism. It's not that Rav Kook actually made peace with the idea of Zionism, but rather he transformed Zionism into theology by absorbing the secular rebellion into religion. So it bears noting that even secular Zionism was a utopian movement which envisaged chevra metukenet, or perfected society. So it's no coincidence that Israel had one of the very first women prime ministers, because the labor Zionist movement was also a utopian kind of end times project that we're going to create a whole new reality, a whole new world, which is what religious Zionists are talking about today. Secular Zionists also wanted a whole land of Israel, and this was part of the national consensus, at least until the First Intifada. In fact, 79 out of the 140 government-sanctioned settlements prior to 1977 were placed there by labor-led parties. In other words, the Labor Party is responsible for over half of the official settlements in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And it meant that we should remember also that labor Zionism extolled the land, which is what the religious Zionists do, so much so that they saw becoming a farmer and making the wasteland bloom the highest good possible. Lastly, or second to lastly here, a couple before, a culture of what's been called illegalism developed in the Yishuv, which came back to haunt the state of Israel later. The tragedy of the Holocaust, the failures of the international community, such as in 1967, contributed to a self-driven activist approaches. And these approaches wanted to show the Jews should be actors in history rather than victims of history, but they often also break rules and mean that it's difficult to create policy approaches. A large part of the settlement movement's success is a result of idealistic Jews born after the heroic era of pioneer settlement in 1948. So people who were born after 1948 felt that they had missed the chance to be pioneer heroes. And when we capture the land in 1967, this is their second chance to emulate the stories of pioneering and to be heroes of their own story, in a sense. It's compared to like the 1968 generation in the United States or in Europe, who grew up on the stories of their parents from the war and could finally step up and be heroes of their own story. Sebastia, which I mentioned, was Gush Emunim's greatest victory, and Gush Katif, the disengagement, its greatest test and biggest defeat, so much so that by 2010 it disbanded. And the disengagement plan, I'll leave with these thoughts. Disengagement plan haunts Israeli society till this day, and it's a great example of the law of unintended consequences, as well as the idea that the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. While it's still a marginal phenomenon, the fact that some religious Zionists see the state of Israel as the enemy and are willing to challenge the state's monopoly on the use of force really should and does worry policymakers. Though I don't see this leading to any alliance in the near future, in some ways you could argue that settlers and Palestinians have more in common than Tel Avivans and settlers, because they distrust the state and they love the land and they see themselves as the original people of it. And this is something which should give us pause for thought. So this polarization that we see is not only ideological. We have this situation currently where religious Zionists have basically shipped themselves off to the territories And there's more than an ideological difference between them and Tel Avivans. There's a growing chasm between them and the rest of Israel because they don't interact. We don't interact with them. They've become, in some ways, a separate sect apart that still needs the state of Israel to do its bidding while disdaining the state that they need the bidding from. So we have this really difficult situation at the moment. Lastly, as the British historian Benedict Anderson wrote in his book Imagined Communities, like religion, nations need stories to bind them. For religious Jews, that story is national redemption and messianic end times through the redemption of the land of Israel. What this implies is that unlike other states that are in the practical business of history and governance, religious Zionism is actually in the business of redemption from history. That could be very worrying if you think about it. So personally, I think we would be foolish not to listen also to Professor Leibovitz, who resisted messianic impulses because he believed that they distracted from religious obligation and they transformed faith into politics. So with that, I end. I show you my business card here. Contact information. If you ever come to Israel interested in meeting settlers, including those in Wildcat outposts, then please be in touch and I can arrange this for you. Otherwise, you can check out my website. It's peopleinplaces.tours and also peoplenotplaces.tours. It's being updated right now, so if you wait a week, it'll be ready. But I have visits to communities such as Druze, Circassians, Ahmadis, Samaritans, Baha'is, Bedouin, Gypsies, etc. All right. I hope you guys are still there
Yes. Yep,
and
we're
found that
still
interesting.
here. Thank you so much, Dr. Dujovny, for such an engaging presentation. I think we can all agree of the clear importance of understanding the history of this particular region before we can understand sort of the settlement movement today. I know I had never heard of the Alone Plan, so I'm planning to go read more about it. And on a very personal note, it was meaningful to hear more about the labor Zionist movement because my grandparents, great grandparents, and as far back as I think you can go, were all members of that movement. So I wanted to see if anyone had any questions. Eyal, if you could stop sharing your
Stop the share.
screen.
Okay. Stop share screen. Is that good now?
And I think so. I think we can see all of us now. We have a question from Harry. What do you see as a possible solution or outcome?
Um, if I knew what the solution or outcome would be, I think it was Arik Sharon who said that, in Israel, the future is uncertain, the past is never finished, and the present is unclear, right? I don't know what would be a solution. I mean, we might end up with two states at some point where there's, if there's a two-state solution for the Palestinians, there might be a two-state solution for Israel, like we had historically between Judea and Israel. And they would, perhaps end up in they won't leave a Palestinian state, probably, many of them. And so we might end up with two states, two Jewish states, and not two Palestinian states as they're thinking. But I don't know. It's really a Gordian knot at the moment. And they're very determined to continue settling.
We have a question from Gail. What kind of Israeli one-state solution do you see happening?
That's also a difficult one. It certainly wouldn't work. Binational states, they don't even work in Belgium, let alone in Israel. I don't see a one-state solution. I see a version of the Alon plan if it were up to the religious Zionists, meaning they would get the people of Gaza to leave. They would have corridors which would leave from corridors that would leave into Jordan, maybe turn Jordan into Palestine. That's something that the religious right would be interested in, but I don't know what the solution. I certainly don't think a one-state solution is viable in any way. It's not viable. Even the Palestinians themselves can't live within one state between Hamas and Fatah. So we've got
Good point.
we've got four states at least at this point in this small little area. And unfortunately, in a situation like this, we've seen like in areas where you have many different groups, that if there is homogenization under nationalism, then it means there are terrible wars and dislocation. So I don't know what it augurs for us at the moment.
Now we have a lot of thank yous.
Okay.
Joni wants to know, will this recording be available on YouTube? And yes, it will.
Yeah.
Give us a few days. Oh, and that was the next question. So I think a
Yeah.
couple of days as soon as Steve can get it up there. Yep, another thank you from Gail. Such a detailed, informative presentation. Thank you, Eyal, for all of your research. Oh, now we're getting a lot.
The
Oh,
United State of
Arlene.
Israel, it's the same
Yeah.
question, basically. If you mean by United State with, Jews and Arabs, then the answer is no. Like I said at the very end, nationalism, the way we think of nationalism, is a 19th century, idea. It came from Herder and the idea of folk and all the stuff that I was talking about. And as I ended with the discussion with Benedict Anderson, states need to have some kind of great idea to bring people together. Americans had the melting pot or, the Constitution or something. Israel had that under labor Zionism, but once they came into power, then the ideas didn't matter as much anymore. They weren't fighting the British. They were now the ones in control. And they didn't have a unifying idea. And the religious Zionists have an idea of what they want, and hence they're more likely to achieve it. But the Arabs have their own ideas. The Arabs are convinced against, I mean, the last 80 years of history and longer, they're convinced that the story that they're in is one of two possible stories. One is the story of Algeria, which is if we keep fighting the Jews, they'll leave like the French left Algeria. That's repeatedly mentioned by Palestinians. They mention Algeria. The other thing is Crusaders. The Crusaders were here 200 years and they left in the end. So they're playing a long game. And I don't think that we would ever be able to have a United States of Israel if it involved having Arabs in large numbers or an Arab state, Arabs which would be a majority in some of those states, right? That would be the idea. There would be Jews in the Arab states and Arabs in the Jewish state, but I don't think it would ever work.
Okay. Will the Arab states help support governance in Gaza?
Those are political questions, and I'm not well placed to answer. I don't know what's going to happen now
Yeah,
after Israel's strike in Doha, right?
yeah.
Clearly, Israel has had enough of Qatar. But the question is, will United Arab Emirates close their embassy in Tel Aviv this week, which is entirely possible? What does that mean about the role of Arab states? Um, Honestly, the best solution for Israel is to win the war decisively and quickly. But we're winning the war not so much and slowly at the moment. And so, for obvious reasons having to do with hostages and international pressure, and it's all clear to us, and maybe even political considerations, as some people claim, um, all of these things are going on at some level. But it certainly doesn't strengthen our position in the Arab world. Everyone likes a winner, and I don't know if we're coming off as such at the moment.
It better be. Edward is asking how to access the recorded version. You'll go to YouTube and type in Volunteers for Israel, and you should see it would be the most recent upload. So I would just say continue to check there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to unmute.
Well, you can schmooze.
Or we can schmooze if no one else has any other questions. That's exactly what we'll do. Eyal knows Eyal knows how this works.
Yeah, we can schmooze.
Yeah.
Thank you
All right.
for inviting me to
Thank
give
you
this talk.
so
This is
much,
my fourth
Eyal.
talk for you guys.
I know. That's why
It's
you know it's
amazing.
schmooze time.
That's how I know about schmooze time.
You're
Exactly.
welcome to stay or go to sleep. I know it's late where you
I'll
are.
stay for a little bit.
Okay.
Maybe some more
And
questions will come up that I can
maybe,
answer. I haven't been able
maybe.
to really answer the ones up to now, but
Yeah.
maybe the ones
Stop.
the ones that come.
It's always funny to me. Sometimes questions are asked and they have nothing to do with the person just talked about, and they do their best to answer, you know?
Yeah.
Usually Pam gets all of our Israel questions because she's here every time. But so yes, we are officially in schmooze mode. I'm going to stop the recording.